Lost in Space, 1965. Cast reveals what most fans never figured out. There is a moment that happens at the end of a long life when a person stops being careful. When they stop thinking about who might get upset, or what the studio might say, or how the story is supposed to go. They just tell the truth. And when the last people who lived through something extraordinary start doing that, the real story finally comes out. That is exactly what has been happening with the cast of Lost in Space. The show ran for 3 seasons, starting in 1965. It put a family called the Robinsons into a spaceship, sent them toward the stars, and then stranded them in the universe with a scheming villain and a robot who warned them about danger every single week. Millions of kids grew up watching it. Most of them thought they knew the whole story. They did not. Not even close. The people who actually lived it have been talking in their final years with a kind of honesty that was simply not possible when careers were still at stake. And what they have revealed changes the way you see almost everything about that show. The robot, the villain, the leading man, the family. All of it looks different once you know what was actually happening behind those cameras. Let us start at the very beginning, because the show that aired on September 15, 1965, was not the show that Irwin Allen originally made. Most people have no idea that a completely different version of Lost in Space existed before a single episode ever reached their television screens. Allen had spent serious money building something he believed in. The original pilot film, called No Place to Hide, cost around $600,000 to produce. That was an almost unbelievable amount for a television pilot at that time. More expensive than anything else that had ever been made for the small screen. Allen hired people with real talent. The cinematographer had won Academy Awards. The writer later worked on Star Trek. The special effects team were genuine professionals. Allen wanted to make something that felt like a real film, not just another television show. And for a while, it looked like he had done exactly that. The story was serious and clean. The Robinson family were not just ordinary people thrown into space. Both parents held doctorate degrees. The children were genuinely gifted. When their ship got knocked off course by a meteor storm and they landed on a strange planet, they had to figure out how to survive using nothing but their intelligence and each other. There was no villain causing problems every week. There was no comedy. There was no robot waving its arms around. Young Will Robinson sat by a campfire and sang an old song called Greensleeves. It was quiet and human and genuinely moving. When Allen screened it for the executives at CBS, they loved it immediately. They bought the show on the spot. And then they handed him a list of changes that turned his serious survival story into something else entirely. They told him the show needed a villain. Someone who could create conflict week after week, without the writers having to invent a brand new threat from scratch every single episode. They told him it needed a robot. The ship needed to be redesigned. Allen pushed back on some of it and gave in on the rest. And the version of Lost in Space that the world eventually watched was born from that compromise. The serious original pilot was locked away. About 80% of its footage was quietly cut apart and stitched into the first 5 episodes of the actual series, with the new characters conveniently written as having stayed behind at the ship each time, explaining why they never appeared in scenes that had been filmed almost a year earlier. One small fact from this period that almost nobody knows. The theme music for Lost in Space was written by a 24-year-old composer named Johnny Williams. You know him today as John Williams, the man who wrote the music for Star Wars, Jaws, and Indiana Jones. The Jupiter 2 interior set alone cost $350,000 to build, making it the most expensive standing television set of its time. More expensive than the entire bridge of the Starship Enterprise on Star Trek. Speaking of Star Trek, the relationship between those two shows is one of the most misunderstood things in television history. Most people assume they were equal competitors. Two great science fiction shows fighting for the same audience in a fair contest. That is not what the numbers show. Lost in Space regularly ranked between 32nd and 35th place in the weekly ratings. Star Trek, during its entire original run, never climbed higher than around 52nd place. The show that everyone now remembers as the gold standard of 1960s science fiction was losing the ratings battle every single week it was on the air. The rivalry actually started before either show had filmed a single scene. Gene Roddenberry pitched Star Trek directly to CBS in a long meeting. The reason the network's executives asked him such detailed questions about his production plans was that they were already deep into developing Lost in Space and had absolutely no intention of buying a second science fiction series. CBS passed on Star Trek. Roddenberry took it to NBC, and then both shows spent 3 seasons chasing the same audience without ever actually airing against each other in the same time slot. The funniest story from this whole rivalry involves a pair of pointed ears. During the 3rd season, the Lost in Space makeup team needed to create an alien child character with pointy ears. They were running short on time and money, which was a permanent condition on that production. Their solution was to borrow the actual molds used to make Mr. Spock's ears from the Star Trek makeup department, paint them a different color, and attach them to their own character. When devoted Star Trek fans spotted the ears on screen, they immediately accused Lost in Space of stealing from their show. The boring truth was that the makeup artists from both productions were close friends who shared resources constantly just to survive their impossible filming schedules. There was no theft. There was just the ordinary desperation of people trying to get a job done. Now here is where the real story of Lost in Space begins. Because the most important thing that ever happened to that show had nothing to do with the network or the ratings or the budget. It had to do with one actor who looked at his character, saw a dead end, and quietly decided to rewrite the entire show around himself. Jonathan Harris had grown up in a 6-story apartment building in the Bronx. His parents were immigrants from Russia. His father worked in the clothing business in Manhattan. The boy who grew up speaking what he later described as rough street slang decided very early in his life that he was going to completely reinvent himself. He changed his last name from Karasukin to Harris at 17 years old, over his father's loud objections. He earned a pharmacy degree that he never used for a single day. He made up an acting resume from scratch and talked his way into a career that eventually included Broadway shows, The Twilight Zone, and over 100 stage productions. When Irwin Allen offered him the role of Dr. Smith on Lost in Space, Harris read the script and immediately understood the trap he was walking into. Dr. Smith, as originally written, was a cold-blooded spy. In the opening minutes of the pilot, he killed a security guard and reprogrammed the robot to murder the Robinson family in their sleep. He was written to be the kind of character the audience would despise, and he was designed to be killed off or written out within 5 episodes. Harris knew exactly what that meant for his career. A role that ends in 5 episodes is not an opportunity. It is a polite way of going nowhere. So he started making changes. Quietly, at first. He would show up on set having stayed up all night writing entirely new pages of dialogue. He would gather the cast and say, "Let us run through the scene. I have changed all the lines." The other actors, including Bill Mumy, who was still just a child at the time, watched this and did not quite know what to make of it. Harris was rewriting scenes and then carefully arranging every moment of the action so that every single scene eventually came back to Dr. Smith. The cowardly flinching, the exaggerated complaints about his back, and especially the long stream of creative insults aimed at the robot. None of that appeared in any official script. Harris invented all of it himself, sitting alone at night constructing phrases like bubble-headed booby, nickel-plated nincompoop, and bellicose bumpkin. He had a very specific reason for the insults. The robot was smart enough to see through all of Smith's schemes, so Smith had to constantly attack it to keep it off balance. Every insult was actually a survival move dressed up as a joke. Harris understood his character more deeply than the people who created him. By the time Irwin Allen fully realized what had happened, Dr. Smith was receiving 500 fan letters a month. Allen had no practical choice but to embrace it. He later admitted openly that Smith was never meant to be a comedy character, but that Jonathan Harris had simply taken over and told everyone what the character should be. Harris negotiated a special guest star credit on all 83 episodes, which was reportedly the first time that particular billing arrangement had ever appeared on American television. But while Harris was winning, Another man was quietly losing everything he had been promised. Guy Williams arrived at Lost in Space as one of the most recognizable faces on American television. He had spent 4 years playing Zorro on Disney, and the show's merchandise had generated $11 million within just a few months of the premiere. He was tall, trained in fencing since he was 7 years old, and genuinely excited to play John Robinson, the brilliant commander leading his family across the universe. This was supposed to be his show. His name was meant to be the one people remembered. The change happened slowly enough that it almost felt accidental. In the first season, Williams' screen time began shrinking as the Dr. Smith storylines grew longer. By the second season, it had become a clear pattern. By the third season, it was simply the way things worked. Williams would come to set, deliver a small handful of lines, and then stand in the background while Harris and Mumi and the robot carried the entire episode forward. Mark Goddard, who played pilot Don West, described the atmosphere directly in later interviews. He said the show had moved toward Smith and the robot, and that Williams took it hard. Harris himself acknowledged what had happened, which is remarkable considering he was the one responsible. He said plainly that Williams had been hired as the star of the show and had ended up with an occasional line every other week. Harris called this very difficult for an actor to endure. He was right. He just kept doing it anyway. Williams filled his time between takes listening to classical music, reading books about astronomy, playing chess, and following the stock market. Bill Mumi gave him the nickname the Comb because Williams constantly groomed himself between scenes, a restless man turning his frustration into something harmless. There was one reported moment where Williams looked at Harris and said, "God damn it, I will kill you, Harris," then added after a pause, "I mean Smith." Whether that pause was genuine or deliberate, it said everything real about the situation he was trapped in. After the show was canceled, Williams discovered that being the forgotten background of his own series had done real damage to his Hollywood career. But halfway around the world, everything was different. Zorro had become a genuine cultural institution in Argentina. The government gave him a luxury apartment near the marina. The wife of President Perón personally invited him to perform at a charity event. He spent the last 21 years of his life living like something close to royalty in a country that had never stopped loving what he meant to them. On May 6, 1989, police entered his apartment in Buenos Aires after friends reported they had not heard from him. They found him alone. A brain aneurysm had killed him approximately a week before anyone came looking. He was 65 years old. No one had known because he was living by himself, and mobile phones did not exist yet. The man who had been promised the lead role of a television series died undiscovered, alone, in a country that had appreciated him far more than his own industry ever did. Bill Mumi later said simply that after the show ended, he never saw Guy Williams again. Not once. While Williams was losing his role in front of the cameras, another man was silently suffering behind them in a way that the production company had decided was simply not their problem to solve. Every child who watched Lost in Space adored the robot. It felt warm and funny and protective despite being built from metal and rubber. The person physically inside that machine for 3 full years was going through something that nobody watching at home could have imagined. Bob May walked into the Lost in Space audition by complete accident. He was at 20th Century Fox applying for an entirely different job when someone sent him to try on the robot suit. The audition was brutally straightforward. If you fit inside it, you were hired. When May climbed out after his first time inside, he was bleeding from the metal edges. He took the job anyway. The suit weighed close to 200 pounds. Under the heat of studio lights, the temperature inside became what May later described as his own personal jacuzzi and sauna at the same time. The costume was nearly completely sealed. On at least 2 confirmed occasions across the 3 seasons, May passed out inside the suit from not having enough oxygen. His eyes would roll back, and he would go completely limp before someone on the crew noticed something was wrong. The production company's official response to these incidents was that there was no time to stop filming. May was a dedicated smoker who would light cigarettes inside the costume during breaks between takes. June Lockhart remembered seeing thin streams of smoke drifting through the robot seams and finding it quietly funny. The most famous story involves Irwin Allen arriving on set between scenes, spotting smoke rising from the apparently empty robot, and panicking that the suit had caught fire. When he discovered it was May enjoying a cigarette, Allen reportedly decided that whenever a script called for the robot to produce smoke effects, May should simply generate them himself. Despite being the physical body behind one of the most beloved characters in television history, Bob May was never credited on screen during the entire original run of the show. Not one episode in 3 full seasons included his name. This meant lower pay and far smaller residuals. As Lost in Space grew into a global franchise generating licensing money for decades, May and his wife were living in a mobile home park in the San Fernando Valley. In November 2008, a wildfire destroyed their home. 2 months after that, May died of heart failure at 69 years old. What made his later years genuinely beautiful was that he responded to all of this with extraordinary kindness rather than anger. He became one of the most beloved people on the science fiction convention circuit, staying at his signing table until every single fan had their moment with him, no matter how many hours it took. He once said that he would stay at any convention until the last fan was done or the cleaning crew made him leave. A man who had been made invisible by the industry that profited from him chose to make absolutely certain that no fan ever felt invisible standing in front of him. The show itself ended without any of the dignity the cast deserved. CBS offered a 4th season with a 15% budget cut. Irwin Allen said no. The show was canceled on February 19, 1968, not because audiences had stopped watching, but because the producer would not accept less money. June Lockhart found out by reading a small notice in her morning newspaper. Bill Mumy cried. There was no farewell party. No phone call from the network thanking them for 3 years of work. Just silence. The 3 Robinson children who are still alive, Bill Mumy, Angela Cartwright, and Marta Kristen, still find their way back to each other. In March 2026, Mumy posted a photograph of all 3 of them together with the caption, Judy, Penny, and Will Robinson, spotted on Earth yesterday. 60 years after the show first aired, they are still showing up for one another. The Robinson family never made a home in the story. The people who played them never stopped finding their way back to each other. That is what most fans never figured out about Lost in Space. It was not really about a family lost in space. It was about real people who found something in each other that outlasted everything the industry did to them. And that story did not end when the cameras stopped rolling. It is still going on right now. If this changed how you see the show or reminded you of something you had forgotten about why you loved it in the first place, leave a comment below and tell us which part of the story genuinely surprised you. There is a lot more where this came from.